Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jaipreet Virdi. It is my absolute pleasure to deliver this lecture for Disability History Month. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Rosamund Oates for the generous invitation to the Manchester Center for Public History and Heritage, the Manchester Metropolitan University, and the Manchester City Council for arranging this event, as well as all the other organizers and volunteers and staff who have made this event possible. And of course, thank you all for joining us today. And I do hope that this talk not only facilitates important scholarly conversations, but also informs a commitment to promote inclusivity and access in our quest for disability advocacy. I'm broadcasting to you from my home office in Newark, Delaware, the unceded ancestral land of the Nantitok and the Lenape tribes, sitting in front of a book wall, and next to me is another bookshelf full of books, and I am surrounded by some very lush plants. I am an Indian woman with shoulder-length curly hair, and I'm currently wearing a white blouse and a dark purple blazer that is affixed with gold embroidery. And today I want to begin my lecture by reading a letter. And this letter was written by a deaf woman named Clara Seaman, who lived in Ithaca, New York in the start of the 20th century. In 1919, she wrote to Arthur Cramp, the director of the propaganda department, which was later renamed the Bureau of Investigation of the American Medical Association. As director, Cramp was the contact person regarding the legitimacy of medical therapies that were available for purchase in the health market, and thus Americans from all over the country often wrote to him asking to verify some marketed product or to confirm the reputation of a practitioner that they were seeking assistance for. So basically, everybody who was worried about their health issue tended to write to Arthur Cramp. And these letters are kept in the AMA archives in Chicago, revealing thousands of stories from deaf persons all over the United States, including Clara. And in her letter, Clara inquired whether Cramp could help her select a new course of treatment. She writes, "There are so many earphones, good, bad, and indifferent, and so many kinds of artificial eardrums, etc. The one who is deaf spends a lot of time, money, and nerves trying them out." So she debated whether it was beneficial to ask another physician for advice, but explained that it is so hard to find a physician who knows enough about these devices to know whether they fit your case or not. And even if a physician did know the best means for restoring her deafness, they couldn't guarantee that the treatment would be permanent. And this is exactly what Clara wanted Arthur Cramp to confirm. Was there an effective, permanent cure for deafness that she could purchase on the health market? Clara's story, like the thousands of Americans who wrote to Cramp, are featured in my book, Hearing Happiness, Deafness Cures in History. At its core, this book is about how cures for deafness imagined and forwarded notions of normality that oftentimes contrasted with the lived experiences of deaf people moving through the world. Following the trails of deaf people in the archives, I uncover stories not just of medical despair and the searches for cures, but also stories of relationship and hope as deaf people negotiated with physicians, hearing aid salesmen, quack sellers, even their families and themselves in their quest for normalcy. These were all stories about the presence of normalcy, and above all, what hearing happiness meant to those who could hardly hear. More importantly, these stories narrate deafness as an auditory and identity spectrum, with the variations of experiences in dealing with it. In other words, a series of negotiations between managing the deafness and attempting to treat it, either to restore lost hearing or to shock, sometimes literally, dead ears to create or make use of residual hearing, even in ears that had never before processed sound. This book has two aims. First, it tells the story of medical and technological interventions for deafness, chronicling the ways in which people attempted to cure their hearing loss. From herbal remedies ground into paste or animal fat dipped into ears, to villages and cultural ritual, blessings and charms, to mechanical and electric prostheses for the ear, and a host of surgical procedures. The history of deafness cures has a very long history. And there's some puzzling stories in here too. And my favorite is actually how in the 1920s there was this airplane diving fad that was very popular, and it was guided on this belief that you would go up into the air and go through a series of loops and turns and then land, supposedly with your hearing restored. Now, secondly, this book pushes us to have crucial conversations about why our society still insists on curing deafness, despite the fact that many deaf people live very fulfilling lives and may not actually want a cure. So I ask us to consider what cure means and the implications that this harmful stigma has on many deaf people, including myself. I was born hearing to Sikh parents in Kuwait. At age 4, I became seriously ill with meningitis that was initially misdiagnosed and dismissed as a case of the flu. By the time I was hospitalized and received treatment, the infection had ravaged my brain. I lost my hearing, my speech, my mobility, and for some time, even my eyesight. And I had to endure months of rehabilitation. My parents, of course, were devastated. Through my illness and recovery, they were also faced with the new reality of raising a deaf child. Many helpful family members and friends often offered their suggestions for tried and tested cures that they had learned from their ancestors. I was taken to different specialists for their opinion, went to India to be blessed, and even to London to see an otolaryngologist who then prescribed me with my first pair of hearing aids. It wasn't until my family immigrated to Canada shortly before the first Gulf War broke out, where my parents learned about a school for the deaf and hard of hearing children. I was then educated in oralism, which required speech therapy, and then mainstreamed with the hearing classes. This was a very long struggle, rife with internalized ableism, especially since I used to get embarrassed whenever people asked me, "What's your accent?" And I answered it that it was a combination of Kuwait and Canadian accent, refusing to reveal that it was in fact my deaf voice. Feeling exposed, vulnerable in this way, made me feel like I had failed to pass, failed to be hearing. My approach to my own deafness changed in adulthood. After spending years adjusting to my analog hearing aids, including being able to talk on the phone, and eventually leaving speech therapy, I was told by my hearing aid consultant that the digital hearing aid market had actually crushed the former technology. What this meant was that if my analog hearing aid broke, then there was no one there to fix it, and I had no other choice but to make the shift toward digital hearing aids, or make the decision to have a cochlear implant. While I was first delighted with my first pair of digital hearing aids, delighted at how inconspicuous they were, this trade-off meant that I couldn't hear as well as I did. I could no longer hear on the telephone either. I could barely hear conversations around me, and my hearing aids then started to become a source of immense frustration instead of freedom. As a historian trained in the history of technology and medicine, I couldn't help but approach my situation analytically. Why were my choices now in fearing hearing aids or surgery? And historians, we spend a lot of time in the archive. And when I was reading through these thousands of letters written by deaf people across the century, written all throughout the 20th century, I saw my story interwoven with theirs. So many advertisements, proposals, programs, etc., all pushing for this ultimate goal for deaf people, and that is to be hearing. To try out this remedy or that hearing aid, to see this specialist or that over and over and over again until this glorious day a cure will be delivered. And that always seems to be the agenda, doesn't it? Deafness, and perhaps disability more broadly, is something that always needs to be fixed, always needs to be corrected to become normal. And no wonder, in this quest of achieving normal citizenship, people were drawn to fake cures, the hucksters in the far. Because if you fail to meet these expectations of normalcy, well then, it's not the cure's fault. It's not society's fault. It's yours. And these are messages that haven't really changed in over 100 years. So now I'm going to turn over to show you a video of the history of deafness cures. Enjoy.